Hey everyone, before we begin tonight's journey into one of humanity's most profound mysteries, take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe if you genuinely enjoy these deep explorations into our hidden past. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's always fascinating to see this community spanning the globe, united in our curiosity about what really happened in the ancient world. Now, dim the lights, get comfortable, maybe turn on that soft fan for some background ambience, and let's ease into tonight's exploration together. We're going back, way back to a time when the gods walked among mortals, when giants strode across the earth, and when beings from beyond taught humanity everything we know about civilization itself. Tonight we're diving into the clay tablets of ancient Sumer, decoding the cuneiform inscriptions that speak of the Anunnaki, examining the controversial but compelling connections to the watchers described in forbidden texts, and ultimately asking one fundamental question: what was their true purpose here on Earth? The answer, as you'll see, is far stranger and more specific than you might imagine. Forget everything you think you know about ancient mythology. Forget the sanitized versions taught in schools. We're going to the source material, the oldest written records of human civilization, texts that predate the Bible by thousands of years, texts that tell a very different story about our origins, our purpose, and the beings who created us. The ancient Sumerians didn't write myths in the way we understand them today. They wrote what they believed to be historical records, chronicles of real events, documentation of their gods' activities among them. And when you read these texts with fresh eyes, when you examine the patterns that emerge, when you connect them to similar accounts from cultures across the globe, something remarkable becomes clear. These weren't abstract deities dwelling in some ethereal heaven. These were physical beings with specific agendas, advanced technology disguised as magic, genetic knowledge that sounds eerily similar to modern science, and above all, a very particular reason for being here. Let me paint you a picture of ancient Sumer, the land between two rivers, the cradle of civilization itself. Around 5,000 years ago, in what is now southern Iraq, something extraordinary happened. Cities rose from the marshlands. Writing appeared as if from nowhere. Mathematics, astronomy, agriculture, law, architecture, all the building blocks of civilization emerged in a cultural explosion that still baffles historians today. The Sumerians themselves never claimed to have invented these things gradually over time. They said their gods gave them this knowledge directly. They carved into clay tablets with meticulous detail exactly who these gods were, what they looked like, where they came from, and, crucially, what they wanted from humanity. These clay tablets survived the millennia because fire, the destroyer of so many ancient texts, actually preserved them. When cities burned, the clay hardened, protecting the words pressed into them. Thousands upon thousands of these tablets have been recovered, translated, and their contents are far more bizarre than most people realize. The Sumerians had a pantheon, yes, but not in the way the Greeks or Romans did. Their gods had specific roles, specific locations, specific technologies. They weren't omnipresent or omnipotent. They had families, they had conflicts, they got tired, they needed workers, and most importantly, they needed something from Earth. The chief gods were called the Anunnaki, a term that translates roughly to those who from heaven to earth came, or princely offspring. This wasn't poetic language describing spiritual beings. The Sumerians were quite literal. These beings, they said, descended from the sky, established cities, created humans through a process that sounds disturbingly like genetic engineering, and put us to work. At the head of this pantheon stood An or Anu, the sky god, the ultimate authority, though notably he rarely came to Earth himself. His sons included Enlil, the Lord of the Air, who functioned as the executive director of Earth operations, and Enki, the Lord of Earth and Waters, the brilliant scientist and creator of humanity. Enki becomes our central figure in this story because, according to the texts, He was the one who actually engineered the human species. He was the geneticist, the craftsman, the problem solver. He resided in a place called the Abzu, described as a freshwater sea beneath the earth, though this might refer to underground facilities or perhaps aquifer systems. The Abzu represented not just a location, but a concept, the source of all knowledge, the foundation of wisdom, the place where the mysteries of creation were understood and manipulated. The texts describe Enki's Abzu as a sacred precinct where no other gods could enter without permission, where secrets were kept, where the fundamental building blocks of life were stored and organized. In the myth Enki and the World Order, we learn that Enki alone possessed complete understanding of the me, the fundamental principles governing reality itself. He was, in modern terms, the chief scientist, the research director, the one who understood how things actually worked beneath the surface. Now, before you dismiss this as primitive mythology, consider what the Sumerians actually said about how humans were created. In the text called Enki and Ninmah, we get detailed descriptions. The gods were complaining about the hard labor they had to perform digging canals, mining resources, maintaining their operations on Earth. The lesser gods, called the Iggi, actually rebelled against this endless toil. The rebellion wasn't a brief protest. It lasted for an extended period, causing serious disruption to the Anunnaki's operations. The texts describe the Igigi putting down their tools, refusing to work, surrounding Enlil's dwelling at night, and demanding relief. This was a labor crisis of the First Order, threatening the entire purpose of the Anunnaki's presence on Earth. Something had to change. The Council of Gods met to address the situation. Various solutions were proposed. Anu suggested destroying the rebels and starting over with new workers brought from Nibiru, but that would require time, resources, and transport capacity they might not have. Enlil wanted to impose harsher discipline, make an example of the ringleaders, force the others back to work. But Enki argued this would only delay the inevitable. The work was genuinely too hard, too dangerous, too degrading even for lesser gods. So Enki proposed a solution that was both brilliant and controversial. Create a primitive worker, a being that could take over the labor, using the essence or clay from the earth, mixing it with the blood of a sacrificed god, specifically a rebel god named Chingu or Weilu, Enki, and the mother goddess Ninmah, fashioned the first humans. The process as described involves taking clay, which in Sumerian texts often referred to biological material, cellular material, the physical substance of the body. Modern scholars translate this as clay because that's what ancient Mesopotamians used as writing material and building material, but the word actually meant something closer to earthly material or physical substance. When you reread the texts with this understanding, forming humans from clay becomes forming humans from earthly biological material. The blood of a god, De'imi in Akkadian, refers to the essence, the life force, the distinguishing characteristics of the divine. In modern terms, this sounds remarkably like DNA, the genetic code that contains all the information necessary to construct a living being. Mixing earthly biological material with divine essence, creating a hybrid being that combines both elements, sounds exactly like genetic engineering. The texts describe Enki and Ninmah working together, with Ninmah shaping the physical forms while Enki provided the design, the template, the specifications. This division of labor makes sense if we think of it as biological engineering, with one specialist handling the physical construction while another handles the genetic design. But here's where it gets even more interesting. The texts describe failures, multiple attempts before achieving success. They created beings that were too weak, too strong, unable to reproduce, defective in various ways. One couldn't urinate properly, another couldn't hold food, a third was born without functioning limbs. These sound like the kind of failures you'd expect in genetic experimentation, attempts to combine incompatible genetic material, working out the bugs in a complex biological engineering project. Eventually they achieved success. The texts describe the first successful Adamu, described as being neither fully human nor fully divine, possessing characteristics of both. This being could perform labor, could follow instructions, possessed enough intelligence to use tools, but not so much intelligence as to threaten the gods. In other words, the perfect worker. But Enki, being Enki, didn't stop there. As he worked with the early humans, as he observed them, he apparently developed compassion for them, saw potential in them beyond mere labor. The texts repeatedly show Enki protecting humans, teaching them, helping them survive when other gods wanted to destroy them. This suggests emotional investment, perhaps even paternal feelings toward his creations. The early humans were created male only, reproduced through artificial means controlled by the gods, ensuring population levels remained manageable. They lived in the Eden, the Mesopotamian plain, working the fields, digging irrigation, channels, mining resources, maintaining the Anunnaki's infrastructure. They were fed, sheltered, and protected, but they weren't free. They were biological tools, property of the gods. Then something changed. Multiple texts describe Enki, sometimes with the assistance of his mother Ninhursag or his daughter Ninti, giving humans the ability to reproduce sexually. This wasn't a minor modification. This was liberation. Sexual reproduction meant humans could increase their numbers independently, could spread beyond the Eden, could eventually become numerous enough that the gods couldn't easily control them. The texts frame this as a transgression, a violation of the original design. Enlil was furious when he discovered what Enki had done. The other gods were concerned about the implications. If humans could reproduce on their own, if they spread and multiplied without limit, they might consume too many resources, make too much noise, become a threat. This is where the Genesis account and the Sumerian accounts align so precisely it can't be coincidence. The serpent in the Garden of Eden giving humans forbidden knowledge, enabling them to be like gods, defying the authority figure who wanted to keep them ignorant and subservient. Enki's symbol was the serpent. Enki repeatedly defied Enlil's orders to benefit humanity. Enki taught humans forbidden knowledge and gave them reproductive capability. The serpent in Genesis isn't evil. The serpent is Enki. And suddenly the entire story flips. The being trying to keep humans simple and obedient, that's Enlil, represented in Genesis as the jealous, controlling aspect of God. The being who wanted to elevate humanity, who gave us knowledge and freedom, that's Enki, represented as the serpent, demonized in later religious tradition because monotheism couldn't accept the concept of divine beings working at cross purposes. When you reread Genesis with this understanding, details snap into focus. God creates man from dust, places him in the garden to work it and keep it. Man is given specific instructions, told what he can and cannot do. The serpent appears and offers knowledge that will make humans like gods, knowing good and evil. Woman is created from man's rib, which sounds like cloning, taking genetic material from one being to create another. They gain knowledge and immediately become aware of their nakedness, their vulnerability, their mortality. God becomes angry at this transgression, asks who told you that you are naked, curses the serpent to crawl on its belly, curses woman with pain in childbirth, curses man with hard labor, and expels them from the garden. They're now on their own, no longer tended and fed, forced to survive through their own efforts. But they have knowledge, consciousness, the ability to reproduce, and ultimately the potential to become truly independent. This isn't a story about sin and punishment. It's a story about enslavement and liberation, about beings who defied their creator's intentions and gained freedom at the cost of security, who chose knowledge and autonomy over ignorance and protection. That's a very different narrative from the theological interpretation that's dominated for thousands of years. The Sumerian version makes this explicit. Enki's gift of reproduction to humanity directly violated Enlil's decree. When Enlil discovered humans were multiplying beyond control, he instituted population reduction measures. First drought, then famine, then plague. each attempt designed to reduce human numbers to manageable levels. Each time, Enki found ways to help humans survive, teaching them agriculture to outlast drought, irrigation to overcome famine, basic medicine to fight plague. Finally, Enlil convinced the Council of Gods to authorize the flood, a final solution to the human problem. Wipe them out completely and either start over or abandon the Earth project entirely. The council agreed, and every god swore an oath not to warn humans about the coming disaster. But Enki, bound by the oath not to directly tell any human, found a loophole. He spoke to the walls of Ziusudra's house, describing the coming flood and what would be needed to survive it. Ziusudra, hidden behind those walls, overheard everything. Enki technically didn't break his oath. He just exploited a technicality to save his favorite human and, through him, ensure humanity's survival. This pattern of Enki finding loopholes, using clever solutions to circumvent direct orders, protecting humans against his brother's wishes, runs throughout the Sumerian texts. He's portrayed as the trickster god, the clever one, the one who cares more about results than rules. But he's also portrayed as genuinely compassionate toward humanity, as seeing value in us beyond our utility as workers. The texts describe attempts, failures, refinements. They talk about beings created with defects, about the need to perfect the design. They speak of genetic material, of mixing divine essence with earthly matter, of creating beings just intelligent enough to follow orders but not so intelligent as to threaten their creators. This sounds less like mythology and more like a laboratory journal. Ancient astronaut theorists, particularly Zecharia Sitchin, have argued that what we're reading here is a description of genetic engineering, of mixing Anunnaki DNA with that of Homo erectus or some other hominid, creating Homo sapiens as a hybrid species. Mainstream scholarship rejects this interpretation, often vehemently. They argue Sitchin mistranslated texts, cherry-picked evidence, and imposed modern concepts onto ancient material. And there's validity to those criticisms. Sitchin wasn't a trained Assyriologist, and he did make leaps that professional scholars find untenable. But here's what's interesting. Even if we set aside Sitchin's specific interpretations about Nibiru and ancient astronauts, the Sumerian texts themselves remain, and they tell a very consistent story across multiple tablets, from multiple cities, spanning centuries. Humans were created to serve the gods. Humans were made to work. Humans were fashioned from earthly and divine components through a deliberate process. The parallels to the Genesis account are impossible to ignore, except the Sumerian version is far older and far more detailed. Genesis says God created man from the dust of the earth and breathed life into him. The Sumerian texts say Enki created man from the clay of the earth, mixed with divine blood. Genesis mentions the Garden of Eden, Eden in Hebrew. The Sumerian texts speak of the Eden, the plain between the Tigris and Euphrates, where the gods established their first operations. Genesis mentions the Nephilim, the giants, the sons of God who mated with the daughters of men. The Sumerian texts are full of demigods, offspring of Anunnaki and humans, kings who ruled for impossible lengths of time because they had divine blood. Let me show you something truly extraordinary. The Sumerian king list, discovered in the early 20th century, is one of the most controversial archaeological documents ever found. It lists rulers of Sumer from the time kingship descended from heaven until the historical period we can verify through other sources. Here's where it gets weird. The list begins with 8 kings who ruled before a great flood. These 8 kings ruled for a combined total of 241,200 years. You read that right. Alulim, the first king, ruled for 28,800 years. Alulim wasn't described as human. He was associated directly with the Anunnaki. The king list continues through the flood and into what it calls after the flood had swept over. The post-flood king still lived extraordinarily long lives, thousands of years, but nothing like the antediluvian rulers. As you move forward in time through the list, the reigns gradually shorten until they reach normal human lifespans. It's as if something changed fundamentally after the flood. Now, scholars explain this as mythology, as exaggeration, as a literary device to show the glory of ancient times. Kings wanted to connect themselves to divine authority, so they inflated the reigns of their predecessors. That's the standard explanation. But it's worth noting that every copy of the king list, from different cities, from different periods, maintains these same extraordinary numbers. The Sumerian explanation for these impossible lifespans involves the Sar, a unit of time supposedly representing one orbit of the planet Nibiru, which they claimed was the home of the Anunnaki. According to later interpretations, one Sar equals 3,600 Earth years. The Anunnaki, being from this planet, measured time in Sars. Their lifespans were about 120 Sars, which translates to over 400,000 Earth years. Whether you accept the Nibiru explanation or not, the texts are clear that the Anunnaki experienced time differently than humans. They were essentially immortal from a human perspective. This meant that a single Anunnaki could oversee human civilization for what seemed like eternity to us, watching generations of humans live and die while they barely aged. This brings us to the purpose question. Why create humans at all? If the Anunnaki had advanced technology, why did they need primitive workers? The text answer this directly. Mining. Specifically, gold mining. Multiple Sumerian sources describe the Anunnaki's need for gold. In some accounts, gold was needed to repair the atmosphere of Nibiru, which was deteriorating. Monoatomic gold suspended in the atmosphere could protect the planet from radiation and atmospheric loss. This is actually not as far-fetched as it sounds. Modern science has explored using particles in the atmosphere for climate modification and radiation shielding. The Anunnaki initially mined the gold themselves, but it was grueling work. The Igigi, the worker class of gods assigned to this task, labored in the mines of Southeast Africa and underwater deposits in the Persian Gulf for thousands of years before they finally rebelled. According to the Atrahasis epic, they burned their tools, surrounded Enlil's dwelling, and demanded relief from their labors. The Council of Gods convened to address this labor crisis. Anu proposed destroying the rebellious Igigi, but Enki argued for a different solution. Why not create a primitive worker who could take over the mining operations? A being just intelligent enough to use tools, follow instructions, and reproduce, but not so intelligent as to threaten the gods' authority. And so the Adamu, the first human, was created. The name itself is revealing. Adamu in Sumerian means of the earth, or earthling. In Hebrew, Adam means essentially the same thing. The biblical Adam wasn't a name, but a species designation. The early humans, according to these texts, were created male only, reproduced through cloning or some other artificial means, and had a limited lifespan. They were essentially biological robots, designed for a specific purpose. But Enki, who the texts describe as compassionate toward his creations, eventually gave humans the ability to reproduce naturally. This granting of reproduction is explicitly described in the texts as against the wishes of Enlil and the ruling council. In Sumerian mythology, Enki is associated with the serpent, with wisdom, with rebellion against authority for the benefit of humanity. Does this sound familiar? The serpent in the Garden of Eden, offering knowledge, offering the ability to be like gods, going against the commands of the authority figure? The parallel is exact. Enki gave humans sexual reproduction, true intelligence, self-awareness. This made them far more capable, but also far more dangerous from the perspective of the ruling Anunnaki. The entity we call the serpent in Genesis might very well be Enki, and suddenly the story flips. The serpent isn't evil. The serpent is the liberator, the one who wanted humans to be more than slaves. The authority figure trying to keep humans ignorant and subservient, that's Enlil. This interpretation is reinforced by what happened next in both the Sumerian and biblical accounts. When humans gained this knowledge, gained the ability to reproduce on their own, gained true self-awareness, they were cast out of the Eden, forced to fend for themselves outside the protected Anunnaki compounds where they had previously lived and worked under direct supervision. In Genesis, this is the fall, humanity's great sin. In the Sumerian version, it's a liberation, albeit a harsh one. Humans now had to survive on their own, but they were free from direct servitude. They could build their own civilizations, develop their own knowledge, determine their own destinies. But that freedom was always partial. The Anunnaki didn't leave Earth. They established cities, temples, centers of operation. They interacted with humans, selected certain humans for special roles, interbred with humans creating hybrid lineages, and most crucially, they taught humans specific knowledge. Enter the Apkallu, the Seven Sages, and here's where our connection to the Watchers becomes undeniable. The Apkallu represent perhaps the most fascinating and least understood aspect of Mesopotamian mythology, beings who bridge the gap between the divine and human realms, between the time of the gods and the age of men. The Apkallu are described in Mesopotamian texts as 7 sages of extraordinary wisdom who came before the Great Flood. They were sent by Enki from the Abzu, from the waters, often depicted as fishmen or men wearing fish skin cloaks. The first and most important of these sages was Uana, also called Adapa, which means the wise one. Understanding Uana is critical because his story contains details that illuminate the entire Watcher's narrative. According to the texts, Uana emerged from the sea, came to the city of Eridu, the first city, and taught humans everything they needed to build civilization. The specificity of what he taught is remarkable. He taught writing, not just as marks on clay, but as a complete system for recording language, thoughts, and knowledge across time. He taught mathematics, not just counting, but geometry, algebra, the base 60 system that underlies all subsequent Mesopotamian calculation. He taught astronomy, how to track celestial movements, predict eclipses, understand the cycles of the sun and moon, map the stars, calculate time. He taught agriculture, not just planting seeds, but irrigation engineering, crop rotation, soil management, the domestication and breeding of plants and animals. He taught law, systems for organizing society, resolving disputes, maintaining order, establishing justice. He taught architecture, how to construct buildings that wouldn't collapse, how to create spaces for specific purposes, how to use materials effectively, how to plan cities. He taught medicine, how to identify diseases, treat injuries, use plants for healing, perform basic surgery. And he taught what the texts call magic, which likely refers to knowledge of natural forces, properties of materials, effects of sound and rhythm, ritual procedures that produce consistent results. 6 more sages followed Uana, each associated with one of the ancient Sumerian cities, each serving as advisor to antediluvian kings, each imparting crucial knowledge. The second sage was Uwan-Duga, described as being endowed with comprehensive intelligence. The third was Enmeduga, the fourth Enmegalama, the fifth Enmebuluga, the sixth Anenlilda, and the seventh Utwabzu, who the texts say was taken up to heaven, never to return. These weren't just teachers. The texts describe them as completing the plans for heaven and earth, as possessing wisdom equal to Enki himself, as being semi-divine beings with extraordinary powers. They could perform feats that amazed even the kings they served. They understood secrets of nature that remained hidden from ordinary humans. They had access to knowledge that seemed to come from the gods themselves. After the flood, according to the Era epic and other sources, the Apkallu were banished back to the Abzu by Marduk, Enki's son who had risen to become king of the gods. The exact reason for this banishment isn't entirely clear from the fragmentary texts we possess. Some scholars suggest they were blamed for contributing to the corruption that led to the flood, Others proposed they were recalled because their direct teaching role was no longer necessary or appropriate after humanity's reset. From then on, human sages called the Ummanu took their place. These were mortal scholars who inherited the knowledge of the Apkallu rather than possessing it innately. The distinction is important. The Apkallu knew things directly, from their own understanding. The Ummanu knew things indirectly, through learning and transmission. Knowledge became something that had to be preserved, taught, passed down, rather than something that simply was. Now let's switch to the Book of Enoch, a Jewish text written around the 2nd century BCE but claiming to record events from before the flood. Enoch, described as the 7th patriarch from Adam, closely paralleling Utuabzu, the 7th Apkallu, is taken on a vision journey where he witnesses events in heaven and learns secrets about the early history of the world. In this text we hear about the Watchers, angels sent to earth to observe and guide humanity. The name Watchers translates the Aramaic word Erin, which means wakeful ones, beings who don't sleep, who maintain constant vigilance. This parallels the Mesopotamian concept perfectly. The Apkallu were described as maintaining the order of heaven and earth, ensuring the plans of the gods were fulfilled, watching over humanity's development. But 200 of these watchers, led by their chief Samyaza, descended to Mount Hermon and decided to take human women as wives, violating divine law. The text is quite specific about this. It names 20 leaders of the Watchers, gives the mountain where they gathered, describes their oath to go through with their plan together, and details what happened next. The transgression wasn't just taking human wives. That was merely the first violation. The real problem, according to Enoch, began when the Watchers started teaching humans what the text explicitly calls forbidden knowledge. This is where the parallel to the Apkallu becomes impossible to ignore. One Watcher named Azazel taught humans how to make swords, knives, shields, and body armor. He taught the art of metallurgy, of extracting ores from the earth, smelting them, combining metals to create bronze, forging tools and weapons that transformed human capability. He taught military, tactics, organized warfare, the art of killing efficiently and at scale. But Azazel didn't stop with warfare. He also taught cosmetics, the beautification of the body, the manipulation of appearance through applied chemistry. He showed women how to use antimony for eye makeup, how to dye fabrics, how to create perfumes and ointments. These might seem trivial compared to weapon making, but they represent the same fundamental principle, using knowledge to transform natural materials into desired forms. Another Watcher named Semyaza, the leader, taught enchantments and root cutting, which likely refers to herbology, pharmacology, the knowledge of which plants heal and which harm, which combinations produce specific effects. This is sophisticated botanical knowledge, requiring understanding of active compounds, dosages, preparation methods. It's medical knowledge, but also potentially toxic knowledge, the power to poison as well as cure. Armoros taught the resolving of enchantments, which might refer to counter-magic, protective rituals, or perhaps medical antidotes to poisons. Barakel taught astrology, the reading of signs in the stars, which for ancient peoples wasn't distinct from astronomy. Understanding celestial patterns meant predicting seasons, understanding time, navigating by stars, and yes, attempting to divine future events from cosmic movements. Kokabiel taught the constellations, the mapping and naming of star patterns, essential knowledge for navigation, timekeeping, and the organization of astronomical data. Ezekiel taught the knowledge of clouds, meteorology, weather prediction, perhaps even weather manipulation, if we take the texts at face value. Arasiel taught the signs of the earth, geology, the understanding of minerals, stones, where to find resources, how to identify valuable materials. Shamsiel taught the signs of the sun, solar observation, understanding of solar cycles, solstices, equinoxes, the solar calendar. Sariel taught the course of the Moon, lunar cycles, tides, the lunar calendar, all essential for agriculture and ritual timing. The list continues with various watchers teaching various branches of knowledge, but the pattern is clear. These beings transmitted comprehensive understanding of the natural world, practical sciences, applied arts, everything necessary to build complex civilization. And this matches exactly what the Apkallu taught, with the crucial difference being perspective. In the Mesopotamian tradition, the Apkallu are generally viewed positively. They brought civilization, they served the gods, they elevated humanity from animal existence to civilized life. They enabled cities, laws, writing, all the things we consider progress. The kings who ruled under their guidance were celebrated. The knowledge they imparted was treasured. In the Jewish tradition recorded by Enoch, the Watchers are rebels, transgressors, corruptors who violated divine law and had to be punished. The knowledge they taught, while useful, was forbidden because it accelerated human development in ways that led to violence, corruption, and the violation of the natural order. Humans learned to make weapons and immediately started killing each other more efficiently. Humans learned to manipulate appearances and became vain, deceitful. Humans learned powerful knowledge without the wisdom to use it responsibly. The offspring of the Watchers and human women, the Nephilim, were giants of terrible power and appetite. According to First Enoch, these beings grew to enormous size, required vast amounts of food to sustain their bulk, consumed everything humans produced, and when humans could no longer feed them, the Nephilim turned to cannibalism, devouring humans and eventually each other. The earth, the text says, laid accusation against the lawless ones. These weren't the noble heroes of Greek mythology. These were monsters, predators, beings whose very existence threatened humanity's survival. Their enormous size, their superhuman strength, their insatiable appetites, all made them fundamentally incompatible with normal human society. And there were hundreds or thousands of them, offspring of 200 Watchers, taking multiple human wives over generations. This brought divine judgment. God commanded the archangels to intervene, to clean up the mess the Watchers had created. Michael was commanded to bind Semyaza and his associates in the valleys of the earth until the final judgment. Gabriel was sent to destroy the Nephilim by turning them against each other, causing them to destroy themselves in mutual warfare. Raphael was sent to bind Azazel in the desert, to throw him into darkness, to cover him with sharp stones. Uriel was sent to warn Noah about the coming flood. The flood itself, in Enoch's account, was specifically designed to cleanse the earth of the corruption introduced by the Watchers and their offspring. It wasn't arbitrary divine cruelty. It was targeted, environmental reset, getting rid of genetic contamination, removing beings that shouldn't exist, giving humanity a fresh start without the Nephilim, without the direct influence of the Watchers, with only preserved knowledge to guide rebuilding. The parallels between the Apkallu and the Watchers are multiple, specific, and undeniable. Both are groups of 7, though Enoch expands to 200. Both descend to earth before the flood. Both teach humans forbidden knowledge, specifically astronomy, divination, weapon-making, magic, and other sciences. Both create hybrid offspring through unions with humans, the Nephilim in the Enochian tradition, the semi-divine kings in the Mesopotamian. Both are associated with the corruption that leads to the flood. Both are punished or banished after the flood, imprisoned in the earth or sent back to the Abzu. The difference is entirely perspective. Same events, same beings, same teachings, same consequences, but interpreted through different theological frameworks. In polytheistic Mesopotamia, different gods having different agendas is normal. Enki helps humans. Enlil opposes them, and this divine conflict is just politics. In monotheistic Judaism, only one God exists, so beings who oppose God's will must be fallen angels, rebels, demons. Yet even within Jewish tradition, the assessment isn't entirely negative. The Book of Jubilees, another Jewish text from the same period, mentions angels coming down to teach humans and initially frames it as a proper mission before things went wrong. The text says that in the days of Jared, father of Enoch, angels of the Lord descended to earth to teach the sons of men judgment and righteousness. Only later did some of them, the ones called Watchers, begin taking human wives and producing the Nephilim. This suggests awareness that the teaching mission was originally legitimate, authorized, appropriate. The transgression wasn't teaching humans, but rather the sexual relationships and the hybrid offspring those relationships produced. If you're trying to uplift a species through education, that's one thing. If you're creating genetically mixed beings that threaten to replace the original species, that's quite another. The Qumran texts, the Dead Sea Scrolls, contain multiple references to the Watchers and elaborate on their story in ways that show the tradition was well developed in Jewish thought of the period. The Damascus document describes the Watchers as angels who fell because they did not keep the commandments of God. The Book of Giants, found among the scrolls, tells stories of the Nephilim from their own perspective, their awareness of their doom, their attempts to understand their fate through dreams and visions. Some scholars, particularly Amar Anas at the University of Tartu, have proposed that the Enoch tradition of the Watchers is directly derived from Mesopotamian accounts of the Apkallu. The Jews spent significant time in Babylonian captivity, from 586 BCE until 538 BCE, when Cyrus of Persia conquered Babylon and allowed them to return. During this exile, Jewish scholars lived in Mesopotamia, had access to cuneiform archives, learned Akkadian, studied Babylonian texts. They encountered the Apkallu traditions, the stories of the antediluvian sages who taught humanity, and they reinterpreted these stories through their monotheistic framework. In a polytheistic system, gods can rebel against each other. Different gods can have different agendas. Divine beings can help humans against other divine beings' wishes, and none of this is inherently evil. It's just politics, conflicting interests, different factions with different goals. Enki helping humans against Enlil's wishes isn't evil in the Sumerian view. It's admirable, actually, the god of wisdom and craftiness outwitting the rigid god of rules and authority. But in monotheism, there's only one true God, and anything that opposes that God's will is by definition evil, rebellious, fallen. So when Jewish scholars encountered stories of divine beings teaching humans forbidden knowledge, producing hybrid offspring, and bringing about conditions that required a flood to fix, they had to reframe it. These beings couldn't be legitimate agents of the one true God. They had to be rebels, fallen angels, demons masquerading as benefactors. And yet, the core story remains the same across both traditions. Beings from the heavens taught humans knowledge we weren't supposed to have yet, created hybrid offspring who possessed superhuman traits, and were punished for these actions when the resulting corruption threatened to destroy human civilization. The question becomes, what's the historical reality behind these parallel accounts? Some researchers point to actual historical events that might underlie these myths. The sudden emergence of advanced civilization in multiple locations around 10 to 12,000 years ago, following the end of the last ice age, could represent the period when these teachers appeared, when knowledge was transmitted, when the great project of elevating humanity began. The megalithic structures from this period, the sophisticated astronomical knowledge, the rapid development of agriculture and animal domestication, all suggest outside intervention, teaching, knowledge transmission from a source more advanced than primitive humans should possess. Let's examine what these beings actually taught, because the specifics matter. The Apkallu taught writing. Cuneiform appeared in Sumer around 3200 BCE, seemingly fully formed. There's minimal archaeological evidence of gradual development. The writing system just appears, already capable of recording complex ideas. The Sumerians credited Enki and his sages with this gift. They taught mathematics. The Sumerian base 60 number system is so sophisticated that we still use it today for measuring time and angles. Where did they get the concept of dividing a circle into 360 degrees, an hour into 60 minutes, a minute into 60 seconds. They said the gods taught them. They taught astronomy. The Sumerians knew about planets invisible to the naked eye. Their cylinder seals show diagrams of the solar system that shouldn't be possible with Bronze Age technology. They knew the Earth was round and calculated its circumference with remarkable accuracy. They tracked planetary movements and predicted celestial events. Their astronomical knowledge forms the foundation of every subsequent ancient civilization's understanding of the heavens. They taught metallurgy. The transition from the Stone Age to the Bronze Age required knowledge of ore extraction, smelting, alloying, and casting. These are complex chemical processes that shouldn't have been discovered by trial and error, yet they appear suddenly in the archaeological record. The Sumerians and the Enoch tradition both attribute metallurgy to divine teachers. They taught agriculture, not just basic farming, but sophisticated irrigation systems, crop rotation, selective breeding of plants and animals, and the domestication of dozens of species simultaneously. The agricultural revolution that made civilization possible happened remarkably quickly in Mesopotamia, again attributed to divine instruction. They taught medicine. Sumerian medical texts describe surgical procedures, pharmaceutical preparations, and diagnostic techniques. They understood anatomy, disease progression, and treatment protocols. This knowledge didn't accumulate gradually. It appears fully formed in the earliest texts. They taught magic and ritual. Now we might dismiss this as superstition, but consider what magic meant to ancient peoples. It was applied knowledge, the manipulation of invisible forces through specific techniques. In a world where the Anunnaki possessed technology that would seem magical, teaching humans simplified versions of this. Technology, even if humans understood it as ritual rather than science, would account for the magical knowledge in these texts. The forbidden knowledge tradition in Enoch emphasizes that this information, while useful, was dangerous. Humans armed with divine knowledge but lacking divine wisdom led to the corruption and violence that precipitated the flood. Knowledge of metallurgy meant weapons. Knowledge of chemistry meant poisons. Knowledge of celestial mechanics meant the ability to predict and plan, to organize, to consolidate power. The Watchers, or Apkallu, essentially armed humanity with tools we weren't evolutionarily prepared to handle responsibly. And if we believe these texts, that's exactly what happened. Human civilization became violent, oppressive, corrupt. The hybrid offspring, the Nephilim or demigod kings, ruled with tyranny. The whole system collapsed into chaos. But let's dig deeper into the purpose question. If the Anunnaki created humans for labor, specifically, mining, and then granted us knowledge that made us less controllable, what was the long game? Why give slaves the tools to potentially overthrow you? Here's where we need to consider that the Anunnaki weren't monolithic. Different factions had different agendas. Enlil, the text suggests, wanted humanity to remain simple, obedient, and limited. He repeatedly tried to reduce the human population, first through plagues and famines, ultimately through the flood. Enki, conversely, seemed to genuinely care about humanity. Time and again, he's described as protecting humans, teaching them, helping them survive disasters. When Enlil decided to destroy humanity with the flood, Enki defied the council and warned his favorite human Ziusudra in the Sumerian version, Utnapishtim in the Akkadian, Noah in the Hebrew. The flood story exists in all three traditions with remarkable consistency. Enlil, or the highest god, decides humanity has become too numerous, too noisy, too problematic. Avot, flood is decreed to wipe them out. But Enki, or a righteous angel, warns one faithful human. That human builds a boat, saves representatives of life on earth, and survives the catastrophe. Afterward, the gods realize they need humans, and make a covenant. In the Sumerian version from the Atrahasis epic after the flood, when the gods smell the sweet savor of Ziusudra's sacrifice, they gather around like flies, because they're starving. Without humans to provide offerings, to maintain the temples, to produce food, the gods suffered. They needed humanity. This reveals something crucial about the Anunnaki's purpose in creating us. We weren't just miners. We were the support system for their entire operation on Earth. We grew their food, maintained their facilities, conducted their rituals, which may have been actual technological procedures we didn't understand, and provided the labor force for all their endeavors. After the flood, the relationship changed. Humanity could no longer be kept as simple slaves. We had knowledge. We could reproduce on our own. We had spread and diversified. The Anunnaki adapted their strategy. Instead of direct control, they moved to indirect governance. They established kingship as an institution. The Sumerian king list explicitly states that kingship descended from heaven after the flood. Kings were chosen from hybrid lineages, those who had Anunnaki blood, to rule over purely human populations. These kings maintained the temples, collected resources, organized labor, and served as intermediaries between the Anunnaki and regular humans. This system appears across all ancient civilizations. Egypt had pharaohs, the sons of gods. China had emperors with the mandate of heaven. India had the divine Varnas with Brahmins descended from the gods. Mesoamerica had god kings. The pattern is universal, a hybrid ruling class claiming descent from sky gods, governing human populations, maintaining massive temple complexes and organizing society around service to these gods. The Anunnaki didn't leave Earth after the flood. They withdrew to a degree, became less directly involved in daily human affairs, but they maintained key centers of power. Temples weren't just religious buildings. Read the descriptions in the texts. They were residences, landing platforms, communication centers, storage facilities. The ziggurats of Mesopotamia weren't just symbolic mountains. They were functional structures with specific purposes. Consider the Temple of Enki at Eridu, the oldest temple in the world. Archaeological evidence shows it was continuously rebuilt in the exact same spot for over 4,000 years. Layer upon layer of temples, each built directly on top of the previous one, suggesting a location of permanent importance. Why? If it's just symbolic, you'd expect the site to shift over time. But if something was actually there, some installation or access point or resource, you'd rebuild in the same spot. The Anunnaki's purpose on Earth, synthesizing all these sources, seems to have involved multiple objectives. Primary objective, resource extraction, particularly gold, possibly other minerals and materials. Secondary objective, establishing a self-sustaining support system, which is why they created humans, to maintain operations with minimal direct oversight. Tertiary objective, genetic experimentation. The texts are full of references to the Anunnaki, creating various life forms, not just humans. They're credited with creating and modifying plants, animals, even monsters in some accounts. Earth may have been a laboratory, a testing ground for biological engineering. Quaternary objective, expanding their operational footprint. As resources in one location depleted, operations moved to new sites. This explains the global distribution of similar megalithic structures, similar flood myths, similar stories of sky gods, similar hybrid lineages. They weren't confined to Mesopotamia. They operated worldwide. Archaeological evidence, while controversial, exists for ancient mining operations that predate known human civilizations. In South Africa, researcher Michael Tellinger has documented stone circles and ancient mine works in an area that matches Sumerian descriptions of the Abzu, the southern land of gold. Some of these mines, when tested, show ages exceeding 100,000 years. The area Tellinger documented contains hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions, of circular stone structures connected by channels and pathways. These aren't natural formations. They're clearly constructed, laid out in patterns that suggest organized purpose. Some researchers have proposed these stone circles functioned as part of an ancient energy distribution network, using sound resonance and geological features to generate or transmit power. The mainstream archaeological community dismisses these claims, suggesting the structures are much more recent, built by indigenous peoples within the last few thousand years for purposes like cattle enclosures or homesteads. But the sheer number of structures, their mathematical relationships, their consistent design elements, and their connection to ancient mines suggests something more organized, more extensive, more ancient than conventional models allow. Tellinger's work includes calculations showing that many of these stone circles are positioned at specific geographic coordinates that encode mathematical constants, astronomical data, and geometric relationships. The golden ratio, phi, appears repeatedly in the spacing and dimensions. The speed of light in meters per second appears as a coordinate. Various fundamental constants of physics show up in the measurements. Now, this could be selective interpretation, finding patterns where they don't actually exist, seeing significance in random distributions. Human brains are pattern recognition machines, and we're very good at finding meaningful looking arrangements, even in random data. The question is whether the patterns Tellinger identified are statistically significant or simply artifacts of selective analysis. What's undeniable is that extensive ancient mining operations existed in southern Africa far earlier than conventional history suggests advanced civilization reached that region. Gold, copper, and tin were extracted in industrial quantities. The tailings, the waste rock from mining operations, date to periods when humans supposedly lived in small hunter-gatherer bands with stone tools. Either the dating is wrong, which is possible, but would require systematic errors across multiple dating methods, or humans were mining in organized industrial operations far earlier than we believe, or someone else was mining using human labor, which is exactly what the Sumerian texts describe. In Bolivia and Peru, we find similar anomalies. The Tiwanaku and Pumapunku sites show construction techniques that shouldn't be possible, with the technology attributed to their builders. Massive stone blocks, some weighing hundreds of tons, cut with precision that exceeds modern masonry, fitted together with tolerances measured in fractions of millimeters, assembled into structures whose purpose remains debated. The conventional dating places these sites around 500 to 600 CE, well within the historical period, but geological evidence suggests the sites might be far older. Water erosion patterns indicate the structures were submerged for extended periods, which would require sea level or lake level changes occurring in the distant past. The blocks show weathering inconsistent with a mere 1,500 years of exposure. The hardness of the stone, diorite and andesite makes cutting and shaping with bronze or copper tools effectively impossible. You can't cut diorite with bronze. The hardness differential doesn't allow it. Yet the blocks show evidence of being sawed, drilled, shaped with what must have been harder cutting tools. Steel or diamond-tipped tools would work, but these didn't exist in ancient Peru according to conventional chronology. Some blocks show evidence of what researchers call scooped cuts, as if the stone was soft when worked, then hardened afterward. This suggests either chemical softening, thermal treatment, or perhaps technologies we don't understand that can temporarily alter stone properties. Ancient Peruvian legends speak of using plant extracts to soften stone, to make it workable like clay before it reset to hardness. Whether these legends have any basis in fact or represent metaphorical descriptions of lost techniques remains unknown. What's clear is that the builders of Pumapunku possessed capabilities exceeding what Bronze Age humans should have, suggesting either much more sophisticated technology existed in the ancient past, or outside assistance provided knowledge and tools beyond what humans had independently developed. In Egypt, the precision of the pyramids, particularly the Great Pyramid of Giza, continues to generate debate. The conventional narrative attributes the Great Pyramid to Pharaoh Khufu, dating it to roughly 2560 BCE, based on historical records, but the structure itself provides no direct evidence of its construction date or builders. The precision of its construction, the mathematical relationships encoded in its dimensions, the astronomical alignments, all suggest knowledge far beyond what early Bronze Age humans should possess. The Great Pyramid's base is level to within a few centimetres across nearly 14 acres. The sides are oriented to the cardinal directions with precision exceeding most modern buildings. The slope angle, the ratio of height to base, the internal chamber dimensions, all encode mathematical constants including pi and phi, the golden ratio. The blocks, averaging 2.5 tons each, are cut and fitted with precision that modern masonry struggles to match. The joints between blocks are so tight you can't insert a knife blade. The corners are sharp and clean. The surfaces were originally covered in polished white limestone casing stones, most of which were later stripped for building material, that reflected sunlight and were reportedly visible from mountains in Israel. The purpose of the structure remains debated. The conventional view holds it's Khufu's tomb, but no mummy was ever found there, no inscriptions identify it as a tomb, and the internal design doesn't match other Egyptian tombs. Alternative theories propose it served as a power generator, an astronomical observatory, a mathematical teaching tool, a cosmic antenna, or various other functions beyond simple burial monument. What's interesting is that the ancient Egyptians themselves never claimed to have built the pyramids of the Giza Plateau. Their records speak of these structures existing before their civilization began, remnants of the first time, the Zep Tepi, when gods ruled Egypt directly. The pyramids, according to Egyptian tradition, were built by divine beings or semi-divine kings from that earlier age. The inventory stela, found near the Sphinx, describes Khufu ordering repairs and maintenance to existing structures, including the Great Pyramid, suggesting it already stood in his time. If authentic, this would push the construction date back by unknown centuries or millennia. Mainstream Egyptology considers the stela a later fabrication, but the debate illustrates how uncertain our knowledge of these structures actually is. Every ancient culture has this same pattern of attributing their greatest works to a previous golden age when gods walked among men, when great works were accomplished that later generations couldn't match. Egyptian civilization emerged essentially fully formed around 3100 BCE with writing, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, architecture, all appearing within a few generations. The standard explanation involves a long, slow development that archaeological evidence simply hasn't revealed yet. The alternative explanation suggests knowledge transmission from an outside source, teaching by beings who already possessed these capabilities. The Mesopotamian tablets contain detailed astronomical knowledge that shouldn't exist. The Mulapin tablets, dating to around 1000 BCE but recording much older information, describe constellations, planetary movements, eclipses and celestial mechanics with precision suggesting either long-term systematic observation or information from observers with better vantage points than Earth's surface. The Sumerians knew that planets orbited the Sun rather than everything orbiting Earth, a heliocentric view that supposedly wasn't developed until Copernicus in the 16th century. Their cylinder seals show what appears to be a solar system diagram with bodies in relative scale and position. They described Saturn as having appendages or ears, which matches the appearance of Saturn's rings in low-resolution telescopes. They tracked Venus's movements and knew it was the same object appearing as morning star and evening star. This knowledge appears complete at the beginning of Sumerian civilization. It doesn't develop gradually through observation and theory. It's simply there, recorded as fact, attributed to teaching from the Anunnaki. Either the Sumerians had optical technology we haven't found, maintained meticulous astronomical records for centuries before developing writing to record them, or someone taught them this information directly. The genetic evidence presents its own mysteries. Human chromosome 2, unique among primates, appears to be the result of 2 ancestral chromosomes fusing end-to-end. This fusion distinguishes humans from our closest relatives, who have 24 pairs of chromosomes while we have 23. The fusion is real, demonstrably occurred in our lineage, and is one of the genetic markers that makes us distinctly human. Could this fusion have been natural, a random mutation that happened to get fixed in the human population? Absolutely. Natural chromosome fusion occurs, though rarely. Could it have been induced artificially as part of genetic modification? Also possible if you had the technology and knowledge to manipulate primate genetics. The Sumerian texts describe exactly such manipulation, Enki and Ninmah working to create humans by combining divine essence with earthly material, refining the design through multiple attempts. Human DNA also shows evidence of what geneticists call selective sweeps, periods when specific genes rapidly spread through the population, suggesting strong selection pressure or, speculatively, deliberate genetic modification. These sweeps occurred at various points in human history, some matching the time frames described in ancient texts for divine intervention. The FOXP2 gene, associated with speech and language development, shows mutations unique to humans that appear relatively recent in evolutionary terms. This gene enables the fine motor control necessary for complex vocalization. Without it, spoken language as we know it wouldn't be possible. When did this mutation appear? The genetic evidence suggests sometime in the last 200,000 years, matching the time frame when anatomically modern humans emerged. But here's what's interesting. The genetic change happened suddenly, spreading rapidly through the population, suggesting either extremely strong selection pressure or a founder effect where a small modified population expanded to replace or interbreed with existing populations. Either scenario is compatible with the text's descriptions of human creation, particularly if the created population was small initially, and then increased to replace or mix with existing hominids. The mitochondrial DNA evidence shows that all modern humans descend from a population that experienced a severe bottleneck, possibly reducing to a few thousand individuals sometime between 50,000 and 100,000 years ago. This mitochondrial Eve represents not the first human woman but the most recent common maternal ancestor of all living humans. The Y chromosome evidence shows a similar bottleneck, Y chromosome Adam, though not necessarily contemporary with mitochondrial Eve. These bottlenecks suggest humanity nearly went extinct at some point, reduced to a tiny population that then expanded. The texts describe exactly this, the flood reducing humanity to one family and their associates who then repopulated the earth. The genetic evidence matches the narrative structure of the myths, whether that's because the myths preserve real historical memory, or because humans invented myths to explain genetic realities they somehow intuited. The distribution of haplogroups, genetic lineages traced through maternal and paternal lines, shows patterns of migration and population expansion consistent with multiple dispersals from the Middle East and Africa. Modern humans appeared to originate in Africa, dispersed through the Middle East, and from there spread globally. This matches the geographic setting of the Sumerian narratives, placing the Anunnaki operations in Mesopotamia and southern Africa, creating humans in these locations who then spread. The sudden appearance of behavioral modernity, the full suite of uniquely human traits including art, music, complex language, symbolic thinking, occurred relatively recently, perhaps 70,000 to 100,000 years ago. Humans with anatomically modern bodies existed earlier, but the cognitive revolution, the emergence of truly modern minds, happened in a comparatively brief period. This suggests a change that was neural, genetic, or both, enabling capabilities that anatomically modern humans initially lacked. What caused this change? The standard explanation involves some combination of brain development, cultural transmission of knowledge, population pressures forcing innovation, and random chance. The alternative explanation suggested by the ancient texts involves deliberate modification of human cognitive capacity by beings who possessed greater intelligence themselves. The texts are quite specific that early humans were simple, capable of following instructions and performing labor, but lacking complex reasoning, self-awareness, or abstract thought. Enki's gift, his transgression, involved upgrading human cognitive capacity to something approaching divine intelligence. Genesis says eating the fruit made humans like gods, knowing good and evil, which sounds like gaining self-awareness, moral reasoning, abstract thought, consciousness itself. If we take these texts seriously, not as religious allegory but as distorted historical records, they describe a process of taking existing hominids and modifying them genetically and cognitively to create modern humans. The modifications enabled language, abstract reasoning, future planning, moral judgment, technological innovation, all. The capabilities that make us distinctly human rather than merely another great ape. The archaeological evidence, the genetic evidence, the textual evidence from multiple independent traditions all point towards something extraordinary in humanity's past. Whether that extraordinary thing was the Anunnaki, the Watchers, ancient astronauts, survivors of an earlier advanced terrestrial civilization, or something else entirely, the pattern suggests human development wasn't entirely natural, wasn't purely the result of gradual evolutionary processes operating over millions of years. We appear to be a modified species, engineered or enhanced or uplifted by intelligences greater than primitive humans possessed. The purpose of this modification, according to the texts, involved creating workers for the gods' operations on Earth. But the modification exceeded its intended purpose. We became not just workers, but conscious beings capable of independent thought, moral reasoning, creativity, eventually capable of challenging our creators, escaping their control, determining our own paths. This doesn't make us less human. It makes our story more complex, our origins more mysterious, our potential perhaps greater than we realize. If we were designed to be more than we started as, if capabilities were built into us that we're still discovering, then our future might hold possibilities we can barely imagine. We might be, in a very real sense, gods in chrysalis form, beings whose true nature hasn't yet fully emerged, who carry potential planted by ancient designers, waiting for the right conditions to manifest. The Watchers watched us then. Perhaps they watch us still, from wherever they withdrew to, monitoring our progress, waiting to see what we become. We're not finished products. We're works in progress, experiments still running, seeds that were planted long ago still growing toward whatever flowering our designers, or evolution, or chance, or God intended. The texts don't tell us our final form. They tell us our origins, our past, the conditions that made us what we are. Where we go from here, what we ultimately become, that's up to us to discover and create. The knowledge the Watchers imparted wasn't just practical skills, wasn't just how to smelt metal or plant crops or read stars. It was seed programming, fundamental concepts encoded in language, mathematics, symbolism, that would unfold over millennia as we developed capacity to understand deeper levels. We're still decoding what they taught us, still discovering implications of knowledge passed down through countless generations, preserved in traditions we don't fully comprehend. Every major human civilization has mystery schools, esoteric traditions, claiming to preserve ancient wisdom from before the flood, from the time of direct divine teaching. Whether these claims have merit varies widely, but the consistency of certain themes across cultures suggests some genuine transmission of knowledge occurred. The Hermetic principle as above, so below, the concept of cosmic cycles, the idea of consciousness as fundamental to reality, geometric and mathematical relationships underlying creation, the power of sound and vibration, all these appear in ancient teachings across cultures. Modern science, pursuing entirely secular investigations, keeps circling back to remarkably similar concepts. Quantum mechanics reveals reality operating in ways that seem almost magical, with observation affecting outcomes, entanglement connecting distant particles, uncertainty built into fundamental levels. The holographic principle suggests the universe might be projection from information encoded at its boundaries. String theory proposes reality as vibration at quantum scales. These aren't mystical notions. These are cutting-edge physics, and they sound suspiciously like what ancient sages taught for millennia. Every ancient culture has this same pattern. A golden age when gods walked, among men, when great works were accomplished, when knowledge was given. Then the gods departed or withdrew, leaving humans to carry on as best they could. Humanity spent the subsequent millennia trying to recapture the glory of that first time, imitating the works of the gods with gradually declining capability until we hit the Dark Ages and had to rebuild from scratch. The Anunnaki, the Watchers, the Apkallu, whatever name you use. They represent a presence in Earth's past that ancient humans universally acknowledged. They came from the sky or from beyond the sky. They had powers humans didn't possess. They created or modified our species. They taught us civilization. They interbred with us, creating hybrid lineages. They required service, resources, worship, and then they withdrew, leaving us with fragments of their knowledge and instructions to remember them. The question isn't whether ancient humans encountered something extraordinary. The question is what that something actually was. Were they extraterrestrials from a distant planet, as Sitchin proposed? Were they survivors of an earlier advanced terrestrial civilization? Were they something else entirely that doesn't fit our modern categories? The texts themselves don't always align perfectly with the ancient astronaut theory. The Anunnaki breathed air, ate food, got tired, could be injured, and even though they lived far longer than humans, they weren't truly immortal. They required technology to accomplish their feats. They had limitations. This suggests beings who were advanced, possibly from elsewhere, but not transcendent in the way we think of spiritual entities. On the other hand, they're described as able to traverse between earth and heaven, between our world and the underworld, to appear and disappear, to perform what ancient humans could only describe as miracles. Were these technological capabilities or something more fundamental that we still don't understand? What we can say with certainty is that the Sumerian texts, when read literally rather than as allegory, describe a specific scenario. Advanced beings came to Earth for resources. They created a worker species through genetic modification. They established operations globally. Some of these beings cared about humans and taught us knowledge that elevated us beyond our intended role. This caused conflict among the Anunnaki themselves. A catastrophe occurred, the flood which reset human civilization. Afterward, the relationship changed to indirect governance through hybrid intermediaries. This narrative, whether literally true or representing some reality filtered through ancient understanding, has implications for how we view human history. If we're a created species rather than purely a product of natural evolution, that changes everything. If civilization was gifted rather than developed organically over millennia, that changes everything. If our myths aren't myths but distorted historical records, that changes everything. Modern humans have existed for roughly 300,000 years according to the fossil record. For most of that time we were hunter-gatherers with stone tools. Then suddenly, around 12,000 years ago, in multiple locations nearly simultaneously, we developed agriculture, writing, mathematics, astronomy, metallurgy, complex social structures, monumental architecture. The standard explanation involves climate change after the Ice Age, creating conditions favorable for civilization. But climate change doesn't explain the sophistication of that first civilizational burst. It doesn't explain how isolated populations in Mesopotamia, Egypt, India, China, and Mesoamerica all developed similar technologies and similar mythologies independently. It doesn't explain the astronomical knowledge encoded in structures worldwide, knowledge of precession, of planetary movements, of celestial mechanics that shouldn't be accessible without advanced instruments. The Anunnaki explanation, while it requires accepting premises mainstream science rejects, actually accounts for these anomalies. If teachers came, if knowledge was imparted, if genetic modifications occurred, then the sudden appearance of civilization makes sense. The global similarities make sense. The gap between what ancient humans should have known and what they demonstrably did know makes sense. Consider the Sumerian description of the solar system. Cylinder seals from the 3rd millennium BCE show what appears to be a planetary model with the Sun at the center, planets in correct relative sizes and positions, and additional celestial bodies. This is 2,000 years before Copernicus proposed heliocentrism. How did the Sumerians know? They said the Anunnaki showed them. They said their gods came from the stars, knew the heavens intimately, and shared this knowledge. Ancient astronaut theorists point to these depictions as proof of extraterrestrial contact. Skeptics argue we're misinterpreting the images, seeing modern knowledge in ambiguous ancient art. But the texts aren't ambiguous. They explicitly describe a cosmology that matches reality better than it should. They describe the sun as a star, Earth as a sphere, planets as worlds, the moon as a reflector of sunlight. These aren't lucky guesses. These are accurate observations that required either advanced instruments or information from those who possessed such instruments. The same pattern appears with medicine. The Sumerians described the body as containing circulation of blood, understood the heart as a pump, knew about organs and their functions, practiced surgery and pharmacology. This knowledge didn't develop gradually. It appears complete in the earliest medical texts. They said Enki taught them, that the Apkallu Wana transmitted this knowledge. In mathematics, the base 60 system came with sophisticated concepts already built in. The idea of place value, of zero, of geometric principles, of algebraic relationships, all present in the earliest Sumerian mathematics. Again, attributed to divine instruction. What makes these attributions compelling is their specificity. The texts don't just say the gods made everything. They detail which god taught what, in what location, during whose reign, for what purpose. The Sumerian texts read like historical documentation, complete with cross-references, dating systems, and verification methods. The genealogies of the Anunnaki, their family relationships, their territories, their conflicts, are recorded with the same bureaucratic detail as land contracts and merchant receipts. The Sumerians didn't distinguish between religious texts and historical documents. To them it was all history, all factual record of events. Let's address the Nibiru question because it's central to Sitchin's interpretation, and also the most speculative aspect. According to Sitchin's reading of Sumerian texts, particularly the Enuma Elish creation epic, Nibiru is a large planet with an elliptical orbit that brings it through our solar system every 3,600 years. The Sumerians, Sitchin claimed, depicted this planet in their cylinder seals and attributed the formation of Earth and the asteroid belt to a cosmic collision between Nibiru and a former planet called Tiamat. The Anunnaki came from Nibiru, mining Earth during their periodic approaches, which explains why they measured time in SARS of 3,600 years. Academic Assyriologists have thoroughly debunked Sitchin's translation of Nibiru. In actual Sumerian and Akkadian texts, Nibiru referred to a planetary body, yes, but most likely Jupiter, not some undiscovered 10th planet. The word meant crossing, or ferry point, and referred to celestial crossings visible to the naked eye. There's no astronomical evidence for a large planet with such an orbit. If Nibiru existed and approached as Sitchin described, it would gravitationally disrupt the orbits of every planet in our solar system every 3,600 years. We'd see the effects in the geological and historical record. We don't. That said, dismissing Nibiru doesn't dismiss the core narrative. The Anunnaki could have come from elsewhere, some other stellar system, arrived at some point in Earth's past, established operations here, and left. The 3,600-year cycle might refer to something else entirely, perhaps orbital periods of their monitoring stations or regular return visits on a schedule based on their homeworld's time frame, not ours. The physical description of the Anunnaki in texts and artwork shows humanoid beings, tall, powerful, often depicted with wings or bird-like features, wearing elaborate headdresses with horns or rays. These descriptions appear remarkably consistent across Mesopotamian, Egyptian, and even Mesoamerican artwork. Beings from the sky, serpent gods, feathered serpents, the iconography overlaps to a suspicious degree. Wings in ancient iconography might represent flying capability, either through technology or some biological feature. The horned headdresses might be helmets or headgear. The staffs and devices they carry might be tools or weapons. If you strip away the mythological interpretation and look at the descriptions practically, you see figures with equipment, vehicles, and capabilities that primitive humans would struggle to describe except in terms they understood. The Apkallu fishman imagery is particularly interesting. Why would wise men be depicted with fish features or fish skin cloaks? One interpretation involves deep sea diving or underwater operations. If the Anunnaki extracted resources from ocean beds, from underwater deposits, they'd need specialized equipment. To ancient observers, workers emerging from the sea in diving suits might very well look like fishmen. The Abzu, Enki's domain, described as beneath the earth or under the waters, might refer to underwater bases, underground facilities, or both. The texts describe Enki ruling from the Abzu, creating life there, possessing technology there that even other Anunnaki didn't have. His symbol was the serpent, representing wisdom, but also water, depths, hidden knowledge. The 7 Apkallu emerging from the Abzu to teach humanity might represent trained specialists, ambassadors from Enki's scientific operations, sent to prepare humans for more complex tasks than simple mining. If the goal evolved from crude labor to maintaining a sophisticated global infrastructure, you'd need to educate your workforce. This education, though, created the problem described in both traditions. Educated slaves aren't slaves anymore. Humans with knowledge, with self-awareness, with reproductive autonomy, couldn't be controlled the way simple workers could. The Igigi Rebellion showed what happened when intelligent beings were worked too hard for too long. The same dynamic would eventually emerge with humans. This is why Enlil wanted to limit human population, why he sent plagues and famines according to the Atrahasis epic. It wasn't cruelty for its own sake. It was resource management. Too many humans consuming too many resources, becoming too independent, potentially threatening the Anunnaki's position. From a cold management perspective, Enlil's position makes sense. Enki's counterposition, protecting and elevating humans, represents a different philosophy. Perhaps he saw potential in humanity beyond mere servitude. Perhaps he developed genuine affection for his creations. Or perhaps he recognized that intelligent, motivated humans would ultimately be more valuable than simple laborers, even if they were harder to control. The conflict between Enlil and Enki runs through all the texts, a repeated pattern. Enlil enforces rules, maintains order, demands obedience. Enki bends rules, solves problems creatively, champions humans. When Enlil decides humanity has become too numerous and noisy, Enki teaches them to be quieter and disperse. When Enlil sends drought, Enki teaches irrigation. When Enlil sends the flood, Enki warns Ziusudra. This sibling rivalry or factional conflict within the Anunnaki hierarchy might explain the mixed messages in ancient religion. Some gods demand absolute obedience and bloody sacrifice. Others teach wisdom and compassion. Some gods seem to hate humanity. Others genuinely help us. These aren't contradictions if different factions among the Anunnaki had different agendas. The Watchers in Enochian tradition show this same split. Most angels remained obedient to the divine command, but 200 chose to descend, chose to interact with humanity in forbidden ways, chose to share knowledge they weren't supposed to share. This wasn't unanimous rebellion. It was a faction breaking ranks, just like Enki's repeated defiance of Enlil's orders. After the flood, the texts describe a restructuring. The Anunnaki couldn't or wouldn't rule humans directly anymore. Too much had changed. Humans spread too far, knew too much, had their own momentum. Instead, the system shifted to kingship, to intermediary rulers from hybrid bloodlines who would govern in the Anunnaki's name. These bloodlines become important. The demigod kings of Sumer, Egypt, and other regions claimed descent from the gods for very specific reasons. They weren't just legitimizing their rule through religion. According to these traditions, they literally had divine genetics, Anunnaki DNA mixed with human, granting them extended lifespans, greater intelligence, larger size, and the right to rule. The Sumerian king list's gradual decrease in reign lengths after the flood might represent genetic dilution. Each generation of kings had less Anunnaki ancestry than the previous, and their traits regressed toward human norms. Within a few hundred years, the demigod kings living thousands of years had been replaced by exceptional humans living perhaps a few hundred years, then normal humans with normal lifespans. This genetic legacy appears in legends worldwide. The heroes of ancient myth, Hercules, Gilgamesh, Samson, Achilles, aren't just strong humans. They're explicitly described as half-divine, offspring of God and mortal, possessing superhuman capabilities. The giants mentioned in multiple traditions, the Nephilim, the Titans, the Rephaim, these aren't metaphors. They're described as physically enormous beings who dominated early human civilization. Genesis 6 describes the Nephilim as mighty men of old, men of renown. Joshua describes Canaanites as giants, tall and powerful. Deuteronomy mentions Og, king of Bashan, whose bed was 9 cubits long and 4 cubits wide, roughly 13 feet by 6 feet. Either this is exaggeration, or these weren't normal humans. Archaeological evidence of giant skeletons is controversial and often dismissed as hoaxes or misidentifications. But throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, before archaeology became a rigidly controlled academic discipline, newspapers regularly reported discoveries of giant human remains, 7 to 10 feet tall, in burial mounds and ancient sites across North America and elsewhere. Most of these reports lack proper documentation. Specimens have disappeared into storage or been lost, and modern scholars are understandably skeptical. But the sheer volume of reports, from different regions, different time periods, describing similar finds, at least raises questions. Were all these reports fabricated? Were they all misidentified animal bones? Or did a population of unusually tall humans or human hybrids exist in our past? The Anunnaki's true purpose on Earth, synthesizing all this information, seems to have been establishing a long-term presence for resource extraction and experimentation. They created humans as biological tools, workers designed for specific tasks. But the experiment evolved beyond its initial parameters. Humans developed intelligence, creativity, spirituality, all qualities that made us more than mere tools. Some Anunnaki, particularly Enki's faction, embraced this development, teaching and elevating humanity, creating a relationship closer to parents and children than masters and slaves. Others, particularly Enlil's faction, saw it as contamination, corruption, a deviation from the plan that needed correction. The flood represented the purge, the reset, an attempt to wipe the slate clean and start over with better control mechanisms, but it failed in its ultimate objective. Humanity survived. Not just Yusudra's family, but likely many humans across the globe who found ways to endure the catastrophe. When the waters receded, humans rebuilt, and this time we had knowledge, skills, and the genetic legacy of our hybrid ancestors. The Anunnaki adapted. Instead of trying to eliminate us or reset us again, they implemented a new system, indirect control through intermediaries, kingship, priesthood, social hierarchies that maintained their worship, delivered resources, and kept human populations organized and manageable. This system worked well for thousands of years. Look at the structure of ancient societies. At the top, a god-king claiming divine ancestry. Below, a priestly class who controlled access to the gods, interpreted divine will, performed rituals. Below them, administrators and warriors. At the bottom, common people who worked the land, produced goods, and funded the entire system through taxes and offerings. This wasn't accidental. This was designed. The temple complexes weren't just religious centers. They were economic engines, collecting produce, organizing labor, storing wealth, and functioning as administrative centers. The ziggurats weren't just symbolic. They were functional structures where heaven and earth met, where the gods resided when they visited. When you read Sumerian texts about temple administration, you get detailed records of offerings brought to the gods. Enormous quantities of grain, beer, animals, precious materials, all delivered to the temples for the gods' sustenance. Where did all that food go? If the gods were spiritual beings, they didn't need literal food. But if the gods were physical beings requiring physical sustenance, those temple offerings make perfect sense. The priests who served in these temples weren't all frauds perpetuating a myth. Some genuinely communicated with the gods, received instructions, witnessed the gods' presence. The texts describe interactions, conversations, visions. Whether these were physical encounters, technological communications, or something else, the priests believed the gods were real and active. As centuries passed, the Anunnaki's direct presence diminished. Perhaps they achieved their objectives and left. Perhaps their operations on Earth became largely automated with human maintenance. Perhaps something happened to them elsewhere, requiring their attention and resources. The texts don't tell us clearly what happened to the Anunnaki after the historical period begins. What we see in the archaeological record is a gradual transition from gods as active participants to gods as distant overseers to gods as abstract concepts. By the time we reach the classical period of Greece and Rome, the gods have become literary figures, mythological rather than historical. The direct connection was lost, but the legacy remained. The hybrid bloodlines claiming divine right to rule, the temple systems collecting resources, the astronomical knowledge encoded in monuments, the sophisticated mathematics underlying architecture, the medical and agricultural knowledge that shouldn't exist, the global myths telling remarkably similar stories. If the Anunnaki were real, if the Watchers were real, if our history includes an intervention by advanced beings who created, modified, and taught us, then we need to completely reassess human origins and development. We're not purely the product of natural selection operating over millions of years. We're an engineered species, designed for a purpose, later freed or liberated from that purpose through factional conflict among our creators, left to develop our own civilizations with fragments of advanced knowledge we only partially understood. This would explain humanity's unique characteristics. We're anomalous among Earth species in our intelligence, our creativity, our adaptability, our technological drive. No other species comes close. The evolutionary gap between us and our closest relatives is enormous and not entirely explained by fossil evidence. Our genetic history shows bottlenecks, population crashes that reduced human diversity to critical levels, suggesting near-extinction events. The most recent major bottleneck occurred around 70,000 years ago, long before recorded history, but if multiple events occurred, if populations were repeatedly reduced or managed, that would leave the genetic signatures we observe. Human chromosome 2, unique among primates, appears to be the result of two ancestral chromosomes fusing. This fusion is often cited as evidence of our evolutionary relationship to other great apes, but it's also anomalous, occurring specifically in our lineage. Some researchers have suggested this fusion might have been artificially induced, part of the genetic modification described in the ancient texts. Obviously that's speculative. We don't have proof of genetic engineering in our past, but we do have ancient texts describing exactly such engineering in surprising detail. We have global myths telling variations of the same story. We have archaeological anomalies that don't fit standard timelines. We have technological knowledge in the ancient world that shouldn't exist. The Anunnaki's purpose might have been much larger than we realize. Earth might have been one operation among many, a resource extraction site that also served as a biological laboratory, a proving ground for genetic experimentation. Humans might have been the most successful of many attempts to create intelligent biological workers. The texts mention other creatures, other attempts, beings that were too weak, too strong, too stupid, too rebellious. Enki and Ninma's drunken contest creating defective humans, the various monsters and hybrid creatures in mythology, these might all represent experimental failures or deliberate creations for specific purposes. When you read ancient mythology not as primitive superstition but as distorted history, patterns emerge that are genuinely disturbing. Beings from the sky take human women by force or seduction. Hybrid offspring are born with superhuman traits. These offspring often become rulers or heroes, but also tyrants and monsters. Conflicts between different factions of gods spill over into human affairs, with humans as collateral damage. The gods demand worship, sacrifice, obedience. They punish infractions harshly. They flood, burn, plague, and destroy when humans displease them. But they also teach, help, guide, and occasionally genuinely care about individual humans. They have favorites, chosen people, special relationships with certain bloodlines or individuals. This doesn't sound like spiritual allegory. It sounds like colonial occupation with all its complexities. Some colonizers are cruel exploiters, others develop genuine bonds with natives. Factions among the colonizers have different policies toward the native population. Eventually the colony achieves some degree of independence, but the legacy of occupation persists. If that analogy holds, we're living in the post-occupation period. The Anunnaki withdrew, mostly or entirely, but we continue the systems they established. Our social hierarchies, our economic structures, our religious institutions, many trace back to patterns established in ancient Mesopotamia. We still organize ourselves around concepts of divine authority, chosen bloodlines, hierarchical control, even though we've secularized the language. Consider modern conspiracy theories about bloodline elites, hidden rulers, secret knowledge. While most of this is unfounded paranoia, the underlying concept comes from ancient reality. There were bloodline elites claiming divine ancestry. There were hidden rulers, the gods operating behind the scenes. There was secret knowledge, teachings passed through mystery schools and priestly castes. The Watchers, in the Enochian tradition, were bound in the valleys of the earth, still the final judgment. If we take this literally rather than spiritually, it raises questions. Where are these valleys? Are the Watchers still here, somehow imprisoned or contained? Various occult traditions claim that fallen angels or imprisoned entities exist in specific locations accessible through ritual or at certain times. Mount Hermon, where the Watchers descended according to the Book of Enoch, remains a significant location in esoteric traditions. Other sites worldwide are associated with similar stories, places where gods descended, where divine beings were imprisoned, where the boundary between our world and others is thin. Whether there's any truth to these traditions or they're purely mythological, the consistent global pattern suggests shared ancient knowledge about certain locations having special significance. The placement of megalithic structures on Earth energy lines, ley lines, or geometric patterns isn't random. Someone in our distant past knew something about the Earth that we've forgotten. The Anunnaki's knowledge of Earth systems, its geology, its resources, its energy flows, exceeded anything humans should know. They mapped the planet accurately, established operations at key locations, built structures aligned with celestial and terrestrial features. This suggests either very long residence here, learning the planet intimately over millennia, or advanced scanning technology that mapped everything quickly. If the Anunnaki had such technology, what happened to it? Did they take it when they left? Is it hidden somewhere, buried, waiting to be rediscovered? Ancient texts describe powerful artifacts, weapons of the gods, devices with extraordinary capabilities. The Ark of the Covenant described as a communication device and weapon, the tablets of destiny, controlling the fates of gods and men, the me, fundamental powers of civilization stored in Enki's possession. These weren't just symbolic objects in the stories. They had specific functions, specific powers, specific dangers for those who mishandled them. The Ark killed those who touched it improperly. The tablets of destiny granted absolute authority to whoever possessed them. The me, when stolen by Inanna, nearly caused catastrophic disruption. If these were technological devices, what happened to them? Were they destroyed, taken away, hidden? Or do they still exist somewhere, misidentified, sitting in museums or buried in archaeological sites, waiting for someone who understands what they really are? The Anunnaki's departure, whenever and however it occurred, left humanity with a strange inheritance. We have knowledge we can't fully explain, capabilities that developed suspiciously quickly, global myths that shouldn't be global, and a nagging sense that we're missing something, that our history is incomplete. Modern humanity has reached a technological level approaching what the ancient texts describe the gods possessing. We're manipulating genetics, extending life, exploring space, harnessing atom energy, creating artificial intelligence. We're becoming what the Anunnaki were, or at least what they appeared to be. Perhaps that was always the purpose. Not just slaves to mine gold, but a species with potential, seeded with divine genetics, taught the foundations of knowledge, then left to develop, to grow, to eventually reach the stars ourselves. Maybe we're not abandoned creations. Maybe we're children who've matured enough to leave the nest. Or maybe the Anunnaki are still watching, waiting to see if we can manage the knowledge they gave us better than our ancestors did. Waiting to see if we'll repeat the pre-flood mistakes or transcend them. The Watcher's true purpose, whether you interpret them as the Anunnaki, as fallen angels, as ancient astronauts, or as metaphors for something we don't have language to describe, involves teaching, transformation, and testing. They came, they taught, they created, they withdrew, and they left us to determine our own path forward. Every generation rediscovers these stories and reinterprets them through contemporary frameworks. The Victorians saw them through the lens of evolution and progress. The 20th century saw them through the lens of ancient astronauts and UFOs. The 21st century sees them through genetics and simulation theory. But the core narrative remains constant. Beings from beyond taught humanity knowledge we weren't supposed to have. This knowledge elevated us but also endangered us. We faced catastrophe, survived, and rebuilt with fragments of what we were taught. We've spent millennia trying to understand who we are, where we came from, and what our purpose might be. The Sumerian texts, the oldest written records we possess, say we were created by the Anunnaki for their purposes. The Jewish texts say we were created by God for his purposes but corrupted by the Watchers. Modern science says we evolved naturally without any particular purpose at all. Maybe the truth involves all three perspectives. We're a species with natural evolutionary origins, modified by advanced intervention, now struggling to understand our own nature and determine our own purpose. We carry genetic legacy from multiple sources, knowledge from multiple teachers, and the freedom to choose what we become. The Watchers watched, the teachers taught, the creators created. Now it's up to us to decide what happens next. We're no longer primitive humans laboring in ignorance. We're technological beings capable of incredible achievements and terrible destruction. We've inherited the legacy of the Anunnaki, for better and worse. Will we use our knowledge to transcend our limitations, to reach the stars, to create and nurture rather than exploit and destroy? Or will we repeat the pre-flood pattern, using divine knowledge for violence, corruption, and ultimately self-destruction? The Anunnaki's true purpose in creating us might be revealed by how we answer that question. If we're an experiment, the results aren't yet final. If we're children of the gods, we're still adolescents figuring out who we want to be. If we're abandoned slaves who broke our chains, we're still learning what freedom means and how to use it. The texts tell us where we came from. They don't tell us where we're going. That part is up to us. We have the knowledge, we have the tools, we have the capability. What we need now is the wisdom to use them properly, to avoid the mistakes of our ancestors, to honor the teachings of those who elevated us while rejecting the control of those who would enslave us. In the end, the Watcher's true purpose might have been to give us the possibility of transcendence, to plant the seeds of divinity within us and see what grows. Some of those seeds became corruption and violence, but some became art, science, compassion, and the drive to understand our place in the cosmos. We're living in the aftermath of a story that began hundreds of thousands of years ago when the Anunnaki first came to Earth. We're the descendants of an ancient project, genetic experiments who escaped the laboratory, students of imprisoned teachers, children of absent parents. Our purpose now is whatever we decide it to be. The Watchers gave us knowledge. What we do with that knowledge determines whether their intervention was a gift or a curse, whether we honor their legacy or squander it, whether we remain earthbound or follow them to the stars. The Sumerian astronomical knowledge deserves deeper examination because it represents perhaps the most compelling evidence for advanced teaching. These weren't simple skywatchers noting the obvious movements of the sun and moon. The Sumerians possessed sophisticated understanding of planetary mechanics, orbital periods, and celestial relationships that required instruments they supposedly didn't have. They knew Saturn had rings, describing it as a planet with ears or appendages. How? Saturn's rings aren't visible to the naked eye. You need a telescope, yet there it is in their iconography, a ringed planet depicted in cylinder seals from the 3rd millennium BCE, 2,000 years before Galileo supposedly discovered Saturn's rings in 1610. They describe Jupiter's 4 major moons, the Galilean satellites, again impossible to see without optical magnification. They tracked Venus's movements with precision, knew it was the same object appearing as both morning and evening star, understood its orbital period around the Sun, not Earth. The Sumerians knew about Uranus and Neptune, planets completely invisible to unaided human vision, too faint and too distant. Yet Sumerian astronomical texts include references to planets beyond Saturn. How did they know these planets existed? The standard academic response involves skepticism about the translations, suggesting we're reading modern astronomical knowledge into ambiguous ancient texts. Perhaps the descriptions don't actually refer to what ancient astronaut theorists claim. Perhaps we're seeing what we want to see, but some Sumerian astronomical observations are unambiguous and verifiable. They calculated the length of the lunar month to within seconds of modern measurements. They understood the precession of the equinoxes, the wobble in Earth's rotation that takes 26,000 years to complete a cycle. They shouldn't know about precession. You need continuous observations spanning centuries, passed down through generations, compiled and calculated with sophisticated mathematics. The Sumerians had this knowledge at the very beginning of their civilization. They didn't develop it gradually. It appears complete in their earliest texts, as if downloaded whole from some external source. The Anunnaki, they said. The gods taught them. Enki and his sages transmitted this knowledge directly. Consider what this means practically. If you wanted to teach primitive humans about the solar system, you'd need to show them somehow. You could describe it, but that's abstract. Better to show images, models, take them to orbit if you had the capability. Some ancient texts describe exactly that. Humans taken to the heavens, shown the earth from above, shown the movements of celestial bodies. Enoch's heavenly journey, where he's shown the mechanisms of the sun, moon and stars, reads like a spacecraft tour. He describes being lifted up, traveling through different levels, seeing Earth from increasingly great heights, watching celestial objects in their courses, learning the orderly movements of the cosmos. This isn't mystical vision language, it's surprisingly technical, describing specific phenomena with specific details. In Ezekiel's vision, the prophet describes a flying craft in terms that sound remarkably like a spacecraft, complete with wheels within wheels, lights, and propulsion systems. Biblical scholars interpret this as divine throne symbolism. But read the actual text. Ezekiel is terrified, overwhelmed, struggling to describe something he's never seen before using the only vocabulary he possesses. When a technologically primitive person encounters advanced technology, they describe it in terms familiar to them. A helicopter becomes a chariot, a fire, horses that fly. A spacecraft becomes a divine throne surrounded by cherubim. The mechanism is translated into mythology because there's no other framework. The Sumerian texts have less of this translation problem because they were written by people who had regular contact with the Anunnaki, who had developed a shared vocabulary for describing their technology, even if the understanding was incomplete. The texts describe the gods using me, translated variously as powers, destinies, or divine attributes, but which might refer to technological devices or protocols. Inanna steals the me from Enki when he's drunk, over 100 specific me covering every aspect of civilization and technology. She loads them onto her boat and flees to her city before Enki realizes what happened. This story is detailed, specific, including lists of exactly which me she took. It reads like an inventory of stolen equipment or data. The me covered everything from kingship and priesthood to music, writing, metalworking, and warfare. But they weren't abstract concepts. They were something physical you could store, transport, and use. Enki kept them in his possession, guarded them carefully, because whoever controlled the me controlled civilization itself. If the me were technological devices, tools, or information databases, suddenly the story makes sense. Inanna didn't just steal ideas. She stole actual objects that enabled her city to develop capabilities it didn't previously have. Enki sent servants to retrieve them, but Inanna had already incorporated them into her city's infrastructure. This pattern of divine technology appears throughout ancient texts. The Ark of the Covenant's description in Exodus sounds like a technical schematic. Specific dimensions, specific materials, specific construction methods, warnings about improper handling leading to death. 200 years of electrical engineering experience makes those warnings sound like descriptions of a high-voltage device. The Ark glowed, killed people who touched it incorrectly, required special transport procedures, and possessed abilities that sound like communication technology. Moses used it to communicate with God. The Israelites followed it through the wilderness, guided by its appearance. When properly housed and maintained, it granted advantages in warfare. Later, when the Philistines captured it, they suffered plagues until they returned it, suggesting it had autonomous defensive capabilities or was actively managed remotely. This doesn't sound like a simple gold-covered box containing stone tablets. It sounds like a device, possibly radioactive, possibly electrically charged, possibly something else entirely we don't have reference for. The tablets of destiny in Mesopotamian texts function similarly. Whoever possesses them commands the other gods, controls the fates, holds supreme authority. Multiple stories involve these tablets being stolen and wars being fought to retrieve them. Why? If they're symbolic, stealing them shouldn't matter. But if they're actual control devices, keys to operational systems, then their theft represents a genuine crisis. These aren't isolated examples. Ancient India's Vedic texts describe vimanas, flying vehicles with specific capabilities, construction methods, and operating procedures. The Mahabharata describes weapons that sound like nuclear devices, complete with effects matching radiation poisoning, blinding light, mushroom clouds, and devastation lasting generations. Chinese texts describe similar technologies, flying dragons and chariots, weapons of divine power, artifacts granting extraordinary abilities. Mesoamerican texts describe gods descending in flying serpents, bringing knowledge and artifacts, establishing dynasties and temples. The global consistency of these accounts suggests either widespread human imagination operating independently to create similar myths, which seems unlikely, or shared origins. For these stories, knowledge passed down from a time when such technology actually existed on Earth. The Anunnaki, or whatever they actually were, possessed capabilities far exceeding primitive human technology. Whether they were extraterrestrials, survivors of an earlier terrestrial advanced civilization, time travelers, interdimensional beings, or something else entirely, they had resources and knowledge that transformed human development. Their departure, whenever and however it occurred, left humanity without access to this technology. We couldn't maintain their systems, operate their devices, or replicate their capabilities, so we reverted to simpler technologies, preserved what knowledge we could through oral tradition and eventually writing, and slowly rebuilt. This explains the pattern we see archaeologically, apparent high knowledge in early civilizations gradually declining into the Dark Ages, then slowly recovering. If civilization was gifted rather than developed, organically this pattern makes perfect sense. We started with more than we earned, lost it when our benefactors left, and spent millennia trying to recover what we'd lost. The archaeological evidence, while disputed, does show some peculiarities that fit this pattern. The precision of early monuments exceeds later attempts. The Great Pyramid's construction precision surpasses anything built in Egypt for the next 2,000 years. The massive stones at Baalbek, Sacsayhuaman, Pumapunku, moved and placed with tolerances that modern engineers struggle to explain, all date to the earliest periods of construction at those sites. Later additions, later repairs, later attempts to replicate these works consistently show decline in capability, as if the original builders had knowledge or technology that later cultures didn't possess. This matches what we'd expect if the earliest construction occurred with Anunnaki guidance, assistance, or technology, and later work represented purely human efforts. The mystery isn't just how they moved massive stones, it's why they moved them at all. What purpose did these megalithic structures serve? Temples for worship seems insufficient. The engineering effort required to construct these sites suggests functional necessity, not just symbolic value. Some researchers propose they functioned as astronomical observatories, which accounts for the celestial alignments. Others suggest they were power generation or distribution systems pointing to unusual geological features at these sites, underground water systems, crystalline rock formations, and electromagnetic anomalies. Still others propose they were communication networks, broadcasting stations, or markers for aerial navigation. When you map megalithic sites globally, patterns emerge, alignments following great circle routes, distances encoding mathematical relationships, clustering around geologically significant areas. If the Anunnaki established a global infrastructure for their operations, they'd need facilities strategically placed. Mining sites would require processing centers. Processing centers would need communication with command centers. Command centers would need transportation hubs. The whole network would function as an integrated system. The sudden collapse of the Bronze Age around 1200 BCE might represent the final failure of this ancient infrastructure. Within 50 years, multiple advanced civilizations across the eastern Mediterranean collapsed almost simultaneously. Mycenae, the Hittites, Ugarit, Troy, dozens of cities and kingdoms fell, burned, abandoned. The standard explanation involves invasions by mysterious sea peoples, climate change, earthquakes, economic disruption. But none of these adequately explains the speed and comprehensiveness of the collapse. It's as if something critical failed, something all these civilizations depended on, and without it they couldn't function. If these Bronze Age civilizations were still partially dependent on ancient Anunnaki infrastructure, knowledge systems, or trade networks established in the distant past, then disruption of that infrastructure would explain the collapse. Key sites destroyed, key knowledge lost, key personnel killed, and suddenly the entire system implodes. The centuries following show a dark age, loss of writing in some regions, population decline, technological regression. Then slowly, new systems emerged, independent of the old infrastructure, based on knowledge preserved through the collapse. Classical civilization rose from the ashes, but it was fundamentally different, no longer connected to the ancient systems. By the time we reached the Greco-Roman world, the gods had become literary figures, their technology interpreted as magic or miracle, their history transformed into mythology. The direct connection was severed. What remained were stories, traditions, philosophical speculations about a time when gods walked among men and wonders were commonplace. Yet some knowledge persisted. Mystery schools, secret societies, esoteric traditions all claimed to preserve ancient wisdom passed down from before the flood, before the catastrophes, from the time of direct divine teaching. Whether these claims have merit remains controversial. Some of the knowledge they preserved, particularly in areas of mathematics, astronomy and symbolism, does suggest roots deeper than conventional history acknowledges. Pythagoras, who supposedly invented his theorem, actually learned it from Egyptian priests who learned it from even older sources. The Pythagorean tradition involves more than geometry. It encompasses a worldview, a cosmology, a method of understanding reality through number and ratio that matches patterns in the ancient texts. The concept of music of the spheres, celestial harmony produced by planetary movements, appears in Greek philosophy but originates in older traditions. The Sumerians understood sound, resonance, and vibration as fundamental properties of reality, describing creation itself as occurring through sound, through the words spoken by the gods bringing matter into form. Modern physics has circled back to remarkably similar concepts. String theory posits reality as vibration at the quantum level. Cymatics demonstrates how sound creates form, organizing matter into geometric patterns. Ancient knowledge dismissed as mysticism now finds echoes in cutting-edge science. Perhaps the Anunnaki understood reality at levels we're only now beginning to comprehend. Perhaps their technology operated on principles we categorize as supernatural, because we lack the scientific framework to understand them. Sufficiently advanced technology, as Arthur C. Clarke noted, becomes indistinguishable from magic. When the Sumerians describe Enki, speaking words of power that create life, alter matter, control elements, maybe they're describing technology that uses sound, resonance, or frequency in ways we haven't mastered. When they describe the gods appearing and disappearing, moving instantly between locations, commanding the elements, maybe they witnessed capabilities that our physics hasn't yet explained. The Anunnaki's purpose in teaching humans might extend beyond creating useful servants. Perhaps they were conducting a long-term experiment in consciousness development, intelligence emergence, technological advancement. Humans might represent a test case, an experiment to see if a biological species can be elevated from animal awareness to cosmic consciousness in a relatively short time span. From this perspective, the genetic modification wasn't just about physical capabilities, it was about giving us the potential for exponential mental and spiritual growth. The knowledge transmission wasn't just practical skills, it was seed programming, fundamental concepts that would unfold over millennia as we developed capacity to understand them. The Watchers, in teaching forbidden knowledge, might have been accelerating this process, pushing humanity to develop faster than the original plan intended. This created the crisis that led to their punishment and the flood. The reset wasn't about cruelty. It was about slowing down a process that was proceeding too rapidly, giving us more time to integrate the changes, to mature before gaining full access to dangerous knowledge. If true, we're still in that experimental process. The Anunnaki might be watching from wherever they withdrew to, monitoring our progress, waiting to see if we can navigate the developmental challenges without destroying ourselves. The 20th century's nuclear weapons, genetic engineering, and artificial intelligence represent perhaps the most critical test yet. We've reached a point where we possess godlike powers without godlike wisdom. We can destroy our entire species, alter our fundamental biology, create conscious machines, yet we still struggle with tribal conflicts, resource competition, and ideological divisions. This is exactly the pattern that led to the pre-flood catastrophe. The difference this time is awareness. We know the danger. We've seen what happens when advanced knowledge meets immature consciousness. The ancient texts, the myths, the warnings, they all tell us the same story. Power without wisdom leads to destruction. Knowledge without ethics leads to corruption. Technology without compassion leads to catastrophe. The Anunnaki's true purpose might ultimately be revealed by what we choose to do at this critical junction in our development. If we use our knowledge to transcend our limitations, to create abundance rather than fight over scarcity, to extend consciousness and compassion rather than accumulate power and control, then their experiment succeeds. We demonstrate that an engineered species can mature into something worthy of cosmic citizenship. If we fail, if we destroy ourselves through nuclear warfare, environmental collapse, technological misuse, or any of the dozen ways our knowledge exceeds our wisdom, then their experiment fails. We become another cautionary tale, another species that couldn't handle the burden of consciousness, another failed attempt to elevate biological life to higher awareness. The text suggests this has happened before. References to previous humanities, previous worlds, previous creations that failed and were destroyed. The Hopi traditions speak of multiple worlds, previous humanities destroyed by various catastrophes due to moral failure. Hindu texts describe cycles of creation and destruction spanning billions of years, yugas where humanity rises and falls repeatedly. Perhaps we're not the first attempt. Perhaps the Anunnaki tried this before with other species on other worlds, or other iterations on this world, and we're simply the latest experiment. That's a humbling thought, but also an empowering one. It means the process continues, the attempt persists, and each iteration learns from previous failures. Our purpose now becomes clear. We must succeed where previous attempts failed. We must integrate knowledge with wisdom, power with compassion, technology with ethics. We must transcend the limitations that destroyed previous civilizations and previous versions of humanity. We must grow up, basically, and prove ourselves worthy of the gifts we've been given. The watchers watched, the teachers taught, the creators created, and now it's our move. We have all the pieces, all the clues, all the knowledge encoded in ancient texts, preserved in traditions, rediscovered through science. We know where we came from, more or less. We know the dangers we face. We know the potential we possess. What happens next depends entirely on the choices we make collectively as a species. The Anunnaki gave us the capability to determine our own fate. That's the greatest gift and the heaviest burden. We're not mindless tools anymore. We're conscious beings with free will, able to choose our path, to create our future, to become whatever we decide to become. That freedom terrifies some people. They'd prefer clear rules, absolute authorities, someone else making the hard choices, but that's not how it works. The gods withdrew, the direct control ended, and we were left to figure it out ourselves. Some call that abandonment. Others call it liberation. I lean toward liberation. Yes, we've made mistakes. Yes, we've repeated the pre-flood pattern of misusing knowledge. But we've also created art, music, literature, philosophy, science, medicine, technology that heals rather than harms. We've shown capacity for incredible compassion, cooperation, creativity. We've begun exploring space, reaching toward the stars, following perhaps in the footsteps of our creators. Maybe that was always the point. Not to keep us as permanent servants, but to seed us with their own capabilities and see if we could independently develop into beings like them. It's what parents do, ultimately. You give children what they need, teach them what you know, and then let them go to become whatever they'll become. The Anunnaki's purpose in creating us might simply be reproduction, not biological reproduction, but consciousness reproduction, spreading intelligence throughout the cosmos by uplifting promising species, teaching them, modifying them, and then stepping back to see what emerges. From this perspective, all the ancient interventions, all the teaching, all the genetic modification, it's a process of seeding consciousness on worlds where it can take root and grow. Earth might be one of many such projects. The Anunnaki might have done this across multiple worlds, creating multiple lines of intelligent beings, each developing their own unique expression of consciousness. This makes the Prime Directive from Star Trek suddenly seem less like science fiction and more like potential cosmic policy. Don't interfere with developing species except at critical stages. Provide the minimum intervention needed to enable development, then withdraw and let natural processes continue. Only intervene again if the species reaches critical developmental thresholds or faces existential threats they can't handle alone. The flood intervention from this angle wasn't arbitrary cruelty. It was necessary course correction when humanity's development became corrupted, when the genetic experiments produced unstable results, when the teaching exceeded our capacity to integrate it responsibly. Better to reset than let the experiment devolve into catastrophe. The post-flood system, with reduced direct contact and indirect governance through intermediaries, represents a more sustainable model. Humanity develops more slowly but more organically, making our own mistakes, learning our own lessons, building civilizations that reflect our choices rather than imposed designs. The periodic rises and falls of civilizations over the past 10,000 years might be natural cycles, similar to individual human development. Children grow through stages, sometimes advancing, sometimes regressing, eventually reaching maturity if they survive the process. Civilizations do the same on longer timescales. We're now in perhaps the most critical phase of our developmental cycle. We possess knowledge and power approaching what the ancient texts attribute to the gods. We face planetary-scale challenges requiring planetary-scale cooperation. We're developing technologies that could destroy us or uplift us depending entirely on how we use them. The Anunnaki's purpose might be revealed in this critical moment by whether we make the transition successfully or not. If we mature into a species capable of cosmic citizenship, capable of managing advanced technology responsibly, capable of extending consciousness and compassion beyond our tribal boundaries, then their experiment succeeds and we join whatever community exists out there among the stars. If we fail, if we destroy ourselves or regress into another dark age, then their experiment continues with whatever survivors remain, or with the next iteration of intelligent life that evolves on this planet in a few million years. The cosmos is patient. Consciousness experiments continue regardless of individual failures. That's both terrifying and comforting. Terrifying because our actions matter immensely. Our choices determine whether this particular experiment succeeds or fails. Comforting because even if we fail, the larger process continues. Consciousness keeps emerging, intelligence keeps developing, experiments keep running. We're part of something much larger than ourselves, a process spanning eons and light years, attempting to fill the universe with awareness, with consciousness observing and experiencing itself through countless forms. The Anunnaki might be one expression of that consciousness, where another. Countless others might exist, each developing uniquely, each contributing their own perspective to the cosmic experience. The ancient texts hint at this larger picture. They describe gods from different realms, beings of various types and powers, hierarchies extending far beyond Earth's local pantheon. The Sumerians knew their gods weren't the only gods. Their world wasn't the only world. They had cosmologies extending across multiple dimensions, multiple levels of reality, multiple categories of being. Modern science has begun discovering similar complexity. Multiple dimensions predicted by string theory, parallel universes implied by quantum mechanics, the possibility of life on billions of planets, consciousness emerging wherever conditions permit. The universe the ancients described, filled with diverse forms of intelligence, operating at different levels, sounds less like primitive mythology and more like sophisticated cosmology. When we truly understand what the Ancient texts are telling us, when we strip away the mythological overlays and the theological interpretations, we find a remarkably consistent message. Intelligence is common in the universe. Advanced beings have visited Earth. They modified our species, taught us fundamental knowledge, and withdrew to let us develop independently. They left instructions, warnings, and promises. The instructions tell us how to build civilization. The warnings tell us what to avoid. The promises tell us what we can become if we succeed. We're living in the aftermath of that ancient intervention, carrying forward an experiment that began hundreds of thousands of years ago. The Watchers watched. The Anunnaki came and taught. Now we're on our own, equipped with knowledge and capability, facing the test of whether we can use what we've been given wisely. The texts tell us others have tried and failed. The destroyed worlds, the fallen civilizations, the extinct species, they're cautionary tales recorded for our benefit. Don't repeat these mistakes, the texts say. Learn from those who came before. Do better than previous attempts. Succeed where others failed. That's the burden and the glory of consciousness. Each generation, each civilization, each species faces the same fundamental test. Can you handle the knowledge you've gained? Can you manage the power you've developed? Can you transcend your base programming and make wise choices even when short-sighted choices offer immediate rewards? Humanity stands at that crossroads now. We have the knowledge. We have the power. What we need is the wisdom to use both properly. The Anunnaki gave us the knowledge. The power we developed ourselves. The wisdom, that's on us. That's the final test. The one that determines whether we join the cosmic community or destroy ourselves trying. The ancient texts emphasize wisdom repeatedly. Knowledge without wisdom leads to disaster. Power without wisdom leads to tyranny. Technology without wisdom leads to catastrophe. The Watchers taught knowledge. They gave power. But wisdom can't be taught directly. It must be earned through experience, through mistakes, through the difficult process of learning what works and what doesn't. That's why the Anunnaki withdrew. Not because they abandoned us, but because we had to develop wisdom ourselves. You can't give someone else's hard-earned wisdom. Each generation, each person, each civilization must discover wisdom through living, through struggling with real choices, real consequences. We're in that process now. We're accumulating the experience necessary to develop wisdom. Sometimes we fail spectacularly. 2 world wars, nuclear weapons, environmental destruction, ongoing conflicts, poverty, injustice, all represent failures to apply wisdom to the knowledge and power we possess. But we have also succeeded in remarkable ways. Global communication systems connecting all of humanity, medical advances extending life and reducing suffering, international cooperation on challenges like disease, climate, and space exploration, growing recognition that we're one species on one planet, and our survival depends on cooperation rather than competition. The Anunnaki's purpose in creating us might be simply to add another voice to the cosmic choir, another perspective to the universal consciousness. We're unique products of our particular history, our specific modifications, our individual development. What we become, if we survive and mature, will be our unique contribution to whatever grand project we're unknowingly part of. Thanks for staying with me through this extensive exploration. If this information resonated with you, if it opened your mind to possibilities you hadn't considered, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and share this with someone who needs to hear it. Let me know in the comments what you think. Are the Sumerian texts recording actual history? Were the Anunnaki real? Are we the product of ancient genetic engineering? What does all this mean for humanity's future? These aren't just academic questions. They affect how we understand ourselves, our purpose, our potential. If we're an engineered species, deliberately modified and taught by advanced beings, then our purpose isn't just biological reproduction and survival. Our purpose involves fulfilling whatever potential was built into us, becoming whatever we were designed to become. That's both inspiring and somewhat daunting. Inspiring because it means we have untapped potential, capabilities we haven't fully realized, a destiny beyond mere survival. Daunting because it means we carry responsibility for living up to that potential, for honoring the gift of consciousness and capability we've been given. The truth, whatever it ultimately proves to be, is written in those ancient texts, encoded in our DNA, preserved in traditions and structures and knowledge that survived from the deep past. We're slowly piecing it together, assembling the puzzle, recovering our history from fragments and whispers and monuments that refuse to fully decay. Keep questioning, keep researching, keep thinking for yourself. The establishment narratives, whether academic or religious or scientific, don't have all the answers. They've created frameworks that work for explaining certain data, but those frameworks weren't designed to incorporate the possibility of ancient intervention, advanced knowledge in the deep past, or the literal interpretation of mythological texts. When you strip away those limiting frameworks and look at the evidence with fresh eyes, patterns emerge that demand explanation. The global consistency of flood myths, the sophisticated astronomical knowledge in ancient texts, the megalithic precision that exceeds later attempts, the sudden emergence of civilization in multiple locations, the genetic anomalies that distinguish humans from other primates, the ancient accounts of giants, hybrids, and divine breeding programs. All of this points towards something extraordinary in our past, something that conventional models can't adequately explain. Whether that something was the Anunnaki, the Watchers, ancient astronauts, or something else entirely, the evidence suggests our origins are far stranger than most people realize. Until next time, take care of yourselves and each other. Remember that we're all in this together, all part of whatever grand experiment or cosmic process brought consciousness to this small planet orbiting an ordinary star. What we do with that consciousness, how we use the knowledge and power we've inherited, that's the story we're writing right now. Let's make it a good one. The Watchers are watching, still perhaps waiting to see what we become. Let's not disappoint them. The journey doesn't end here. These texts continue to fascinate, to challenge, to inspire new interpretations and new understandings with each generation. As archaeology uncovers more sites, as linguists refine translations, as new theoretical frameworks emerge for understanding ancient cultures, our relationship with these texts evolves. What remains constant is the power of the questions they raise and the depth of the traditions they represent. 5,000 years is a long time. The fact that we're still reading these texts, still discussing them, still finding meaning in them, testifies to their enduring significance. The Sumerians who first carved these stories into clay could scarcely have imagined that people, 5 millennia later, would still be reading their words, still pondering their meanings, still wrestling with the mysteries they recorded. But perhaps they did imagine it. Perhaps that's why they used clay, why they created writing systems designed to last, why they preserved these stories with such care. They wanted us to know. They wanted future generations to remember. They believed these stories contained truths too important to lose, and here we are, 5,000 years later, proving them right. The Watcher's purpose on Earth, whatever it truly was, continues to matter. The ancient wisdom continues to speak, and we, the descendants of those first humans created to serve the gods or elevated by divine teaching, or however we choose to understand our origins, we continue to seek, to question, to wonder, to reach towards something higher than ourselves. That seeking, that wondering, that reaching, maybe that's the real purpose revealed in these ancient texts. Not that we should serve particular masters or worship particular gods, but that we should never stop seeking wisdom, never stop questioning our place in the cosmos, never stop reaching for connection with powers and purposes beyond ourselves. Thank you again for watching. May your own journey of discovery be as rewarding as mine has been in preparing this exploration. Until next time, keep seeking, keep wondering, and keep the ancient wisdom alive in your hearts and minds. As we close this exploration, remember that what we've covered tonight represents just the beginning of these mysteries, not their end. Every text we've examined has layers we haven't fully explored, connections we haven't completely traced, implications we haven't entirely unpacked. The Enuma Elish alone could sustain months of study. The Atrahasis contains nuances we've only touched upon. The Book of Enoch branches into territory we haven't even approached, and the archaeological evidence continues to evolve as new discoveries are made. Consider that most of the cuneiform tablets recovered from ancient Mesopotamia remain untranslated. The British Museum alone houses around 100,000 unpublished tablets. Who knows what stories, what variations, what new information about the Anunnaki and their purposes might be hiding in those texts, waiting for scholars to read them. Every year brings new discoveries, new sights, new perspectives on ancient cultures we thought we understood. The conversation continues. Scholars debate, researchers investigate, and ordinary people like us keep asking questions about our origins, our purpose, our connection to something greater than ourselves. These ancient texts don't provide final answers, but they do provide a foundation, a starting point, a framework within which to explore the deepest questions of human existence. And that, perhaps, is exactly what they were meant to do.